Hello friend, welcome back. In our previous video, we successfully insert our album, right? So now I want to define some of the link for our this all that musician page. Like here, there is our right now I have the three musician as a Kazarian, the Michael Jackson and the Taylor Swift. So right now, if you click as a Kazarian, it should be redirected to our another page with a specific one of the ID. Like here, if you go to our database, that means here that is our album. And if you go to our musician, and for the every musician they have some of the unique ID, right? That is actually the ID. So with this ID I want to load our this total page, and also into this ID here I have also defined another foreign key. So into this foreign key here, that is will be matched with our this artist ID, right? So with this artist, that means one is for our Kazarian, that means a musician Kazarian. I want to get all the data with this ID. Okay, so how can do this work? In this video I want to show you. So for doing this, first of all, here we have to define some of the link. So here, if you want to define this link, that is in our index page. So now go to our index HTML, that means here. So here I want to define one of the ahref, and I have to finish it. I just simply cut it, and here I finish it. Okay, now if you click as a save all, and now if you refresh it, now you can see it's now getting that link. So now I want to do, if you click as a Kazarian, then automatically it should be getting all that Kazarian details. Also it should be getting all that Kazarian details related all that album, right? Because here I have also defined one of the foreign key as a this ID, that means the artist ID, that is actually ID1, and also you can see that is actually the ID1. So this ID means the Kazarian. So this Kazarian related all that album, so that is our all that album list. So here I also want to get all that our album list, then I want to display all the data in our specific another page. So how can do that work? So for doing this, we have to pass that things with a specific one of the ID. Like if you go to our admin panel, into the admin panel, if you go to, so I just refresh it, and now right now they have the three musicians, right? So if you now open one, now you can see it's now showing as a ID 6, and also if you go as a Kazarian, now you can see it's also showing as a ID1. That means ID1, all the data is now visible, right? So also here we have to define the same things. If you go to our fast tab, and into the fast tab, there is our album. So right now they have the three album. Like if you open our test album, you can see there is actually the ID as a 3, and into the 3 ID they have all that album details. So here now we have to do the same things. We have to also pass some of the ID. So for doing this, here I have already created one of the view page. Like here, if you go to our template, into the template, I have already created one of the page as a album list.html, right? So here I want to visible it. So if you want to visible it, then you have to define that things first of all in our URL. So I have already created one of the URL for this. If you go to our fast application, into the fast application, and that is our URL, right? So right now we don't need this. Like here there is a form, there is a view album, so we don't need this index. I remove it. There is the album list will be needed, and that is our URL. So into this URL I have already defined one of the path as a album list, right? And also I define our view and then our function name as album list, and I just named that path as a album list. So now here we have to define one of the ID, because here we have to pass some of the ID, right? So if you want to pass some of the ID in your path, then how can do that work? For doing this, it's pretty much simple. Here you have to define one of the ID. So I just simply define as init. Okay, I just simply define as init, and into this init, whatever the name you want to define, you can define that things on here. Like you can define as a only ID, or rather than if you want to define as a artist ID. If you want to make that things more specific, then you can use it. So I just simply define as a artist underscore ID. Okay, and also after that we have to finish it. So I just simply finish that ID. So that means here that will be our URL, and after that URL it should be loaded one of the ID. So now we have to define this. We have to define this in our index. That means here there is our index page. So that is our index. So if you go to the template, the fast application, and that is our index. And into the index here I have defined one of the href. So here we have to define this URL. So if you want to define that URL, I think you already know about it. First of all, Here you have to define that key. So sorry, first of all, here we have to define the percentage, and into the double percentage, here you have to define that key as a URL. So I just simply define as a URL, and then here I have to define our URL name. So the URL, our app name as a fast app. So with this fast app, I want to display our URL. So our URL name I have defined as the album list, and also after that album list they have one of the ID. So I have to defining it. So I just simply define after that will be our album list, and also after that album list we have to define our ID. So I just simply name it as a here I have defined that name. I have defined that name as a artist ID. So here if you put that as a only ID, then you have to define also as a ID on here. So right now I am using that artist ID. So I just simply copy it, and now here after that you have to define that artist ID. Okay, and here I want to display our, that means here right now I am already into our for each loop, and into the for each loop I get all that our table data, that means the musician table data, and take the data with this our musician. That means here I call it in our for each loop area with the musician, right? So with this musician I have already display our database table field as a first name. I have also defined our database table name as a last name. So if you go to our database, into the database, so that is our if you go to our musician, and into the musician you can see that is our first name field, there is a last name field, and there is an instrument. And now I want to access our this ID. That means here also we have to define that field ID with this musician, right? So now in our ID area I just define our musician. With this musician I define our database field name, as a ID. Okay friend, I hope it should be very much clear to you. Now I show you, like here if you click as a save all, first of all I want to check it, everything is running well. Now go here, refresh it again. So now they have some of the error as a reserved and fast name album list not found. And here that means in our URL position I have defined, you can see I define as a slash, so it should be as a column. Okay, right, it should be as a column, and then the first name column, and then our album list, and then our ID, and then our ID, that means our database ID field name. So here make that sure you're using that column. So now I want to click as a save all, and now refresh it again. Yeah, it's now perfect. So now I want to if you click as a Kazi ID, and then it should be redirected to our, you can see in our that position is showing as a album, a list, and then one ID is now showing as a 2 ID, and also it's now showing as a 6 ID. That means it's appropriately getting our all that ID. So now if you want to redact it, first of all you have to work in our view, and into the view area here, that is our album list, and into the album list area I have already defined one of the ID. So I have already defined one of the ID as a artist ID. So we have to also add that things in our that position. That means in our request, into the request also we have to pass our this ID. Okay, so now if you actually save it, I just click on the save all, and now if you refresh it, and now if you click as a Kazarian, yes, you can see it's now perfectly redirected to our album list page with a specific one of the ID. And also now if you go to that Michael Jackson, you can see it's now perfectly redirected to our list page, that means the album list page with a specific one of the ID. And for the album list page here I have already defined, like here I have already defined one of the H1 tags. So right now only our this text is visible, but it's all appropriately getting our this ID, that's the 2 ID, and that is a Taylor Swift. You can see there is an album list, and with the album list there is a 6 ID. So now I want to get all that our specific ID data and visible that things on here. So now we have to work for this. So for doing this in our view, that means here we have to work. So first of all I want to get all the data. For doing this I want to take one of the variable. I just take one of the variable as a artist info. So I just simply define as artist info one of the variable, and then our model name. So our model, I want to get all the data from our musician. So I just simply define our model name. So our model as a musician, and from the model I want to get all that our objects. So I just simply define as object, right, objects, and into this object I want to get our primary all the data. So if you want to get that primary data, I have already discussed about that things with you, that is our primary ID. So if you want to get that primary ID, then you have to define as a get method, right? So here I just simply define as a get our pk means our primary key, and our primary key here I have already defined our primary key in our URL area. I have defined that things with our artist ID, right? That means this one. So I just simply define our primary key will be as a artist ID. And now we have to pass that our artist information. That means artist info, we have to pass it. So it's simple. I just simply define as artist info, and here I just simply pass all that information in our list page. That means the album list page, right? So now I just simply pass it. So now we can actually, with this, we can actually display all that our details. That means our artist details in our album list page area. So now open our album list here. So first of all, I want to check it, like here I want to check it with our I get all the data or not. So with this artist ID, if you now click as a save all, so I just click the save all, and now if you go here and refresh it, go to home, go to Kazarian, yeah, you can see it's now showing as a one ID data as a Kazarian. And also if you go to that Michael Jackson, so that is a 2 ID data is Michael Jackson is perfectly showing on here, right? Perfect. So I hope, friend, you can well understand about it. So with this we actually visible it. So better I want to organize it, and I want to display that our artist list perfectly in our that position. That means in our album list page area. So for doing this, I want to take one of the h4 tag. Okay, into the h4 tag I name it as a artist name, and our artist name will be with our first name and the last name, right? So I have already get all the data. I get all the data with our this artist info. So now with this artist info, I want to display our database field name, and that is our database field name as a first name and the last name and the instrument. Better go to our structure. That is our first name. I just simply copy it. Here I define as a first name. And also I want to display our last name. That means here our another field, our database field as a last name. I just simply copy it. I just simply define as a last name. And also there is another one as the instrument. So I also want to display it. Better I define as our instrument name. Okay, instrument name and instrument name. Here there is only one field will be needed. So with this artist info, I want to display our installment field name, as a installment. So I just simply copy it, and now here I just simply paste it. Okay, friend, I hope you can well understand about it. So now let's check this out. If you click as a save all, I want to check it fast. Everything is running well. Go to our site, refresh that page, go to that Kazarian. Yeah, you can see it's now showing as the artist name as a Kazarian, and also showing as the instrument name as a guitar. And if you go back, go to that Michael Jackson, it's now showing as the artist name as a Michael Jackson, a specific one of the ID as a 2 ID data, and instrument name is also showing as a tabla. Perfect. That means we appropriately getting all that our data, right? That is our 6 ID data, ID name is visible, and also instrument is visible. So in our next video, I want to get a specific 6 ID, all that album data. Okay, so all that album data right now, I think you already know about it. So that is actually the ID1, it means the Kazarian. And if you go here, and that is our album, and you can see artist name as ID1, all that album data. I also want to get it, and also want to visible that things in our album list page. So how we can do that work? In our next video, I will show you that things with a live example. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.